Hello, everyone. This is Josh at Checkmate. We'll get started with today's webinar here in a couple of minutes. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. I'll actually get started in a minute. It's already 12:01, so just give folks another few seconds here to get into the session. Okay. Perfect. Okay, sorry guys. Had a little technical difficulty there. My audio shut off, so now we are back in business. So thank you everybody for dialing or signing on for today's webinar, where we're going to get into the details on the newly released PPP loan forgiveness application. I am not going to be presenting today on how to complete the application or anything of that nature. I'm also not going to be diving into deep details on how to use the PPP loan forgiveness spreadsheet that we previously provided. What I am going to do is I'm going to cover the most impactful elements of the PPP loan forgiveness application that represent new details or changes to what we previously understood the loan forgiveness was going to include. That's what I'm going to highlight today. I'm going to be going into a fair amount of detail on some of these items, but I will be presenting another webinar I haven't figured out yet if this will be the end of next week, probably the end of next week, if not the beginning of the following week. But that webinar will be how to apply all of the knowledge that we now have and actually extract information from the reports that Checkmate has created for you in order to prepare all of the documentation that you need in order to submit your loan forgiveness application. So that will be a webinar that we're going to cover either next Friday or possibly the following Monday. And there'll be more news on that as soon as possible with a registration link for you guys to sign up with. So going into this again, the number one thing I'm going to cover is the new information that was conveyed in the form of the SBA loan forgiveness application. Some of this will be good news for many of you. Some of this will also make your head spin. It is what it is. That's what happens with apparently the new world that we live in. So before I dive into today's presentation, I do want to just talk about briefly, where we are at here. So where we are at here is we've now had, through the CARES Act, we've had two rounds of PPP funding. There is still a small amount of PPP money left for the second round. I know that specifically, New Hampshire banks, community banks primarily, are still able to get loans processed and approved, but that money is quickly drying up. So there were two rounds of that, and there have now been multiple instances of interim final rules from the SBA providing clarification on how the program is supposed to work. And it seems like, every time you turn around, every time you blink your eyes, there are changes happening. There's new details coming out. And I don't anticipate that changing here in the near future, because right now, there's pending legislation. There's a bill that passed the House, which is called the HEROES Act, which is a very political thing. I'm not anticipating that there's going to be much that is in that act that actually comes to fruition, but there probably will be variations of some of those things that are included in that act that will come to fruition, either in another grand, economic recovery bill, or an isolated bill that they might, simply pass in order to make modifications to the PPP program. The word on the street right now that sounds like is most likely to happen is that they might pass separate legislation sometime. At this point, I'd be surprised if it happens before the middle of June, but that could potentially extend the covered period, or the PPP loan period, from 8 weeks to 10 or 12 weeks, or possibly even 16 weeks. And there's a slight possibility there might be some rule changes around the percentage, that's 75%, 25%. 75% of your PPP money needs to be spent on payroll costs or more, and 25% or less needs to be spent on non-payroll costs. Those two things could change. There could also be all sorts of changes that I'm not anticipating right now. So again, as I've said in previous webinars, we can only do as much with information that we know and have confidence in now. And we need to recognize those areas where we don't have that knowledge or confidence, so that we can, make the decisions that we're capable of making right now to the best of our ability. But we should always be keeping in mind a worst case scenario possibility, which would be that some of our PPP loan money is converted into a 1% or has a 1% interest rate on it, payable back over a span of 2 years. I don't think that it's wise for anyone to speculate or start trying to make decisions based on any pending legislation at all. It's just it's really you could find yourself wasting, I can't even imagine how many hours of your time. So I would suggest that you do your best to get good information from some of the sources that you're connected to, including this presentation, And then, as I said before, in the webinar in about a week or so, I will be doing a deeper dive into how to apply the knowledge that I'm sharing here today into reworking your PPP loan forgiveness calculation through this calculator that we've shared with you all. And if we haven't shared that with you, everyone who's on the webinar today will be getting a copy of the spreadsheet, which has all sorts of formulas in it to assist you with the calculation of all of your numbers. And the reports that we have provided for you out in the Checkmate system, are all designed around, each piece, providing you with knowledge of each piece that you need to account for in your loan forgiveness calculation. But for right now, I need to spend our time today getting into the details on what has changed. So before I do that, though, as you can see on the screen here, I do need to give us a caveat, which is that regardless of the details that I'm about to present on, the loan forgiveness application and the loan forgiveness application published by the SBA, forgiveness will ultimately be determined finally and solely by your lender. The lender might not use the SBA application at all. I've heard rumor that there are some banks out there that have, decided they're just going to, toss that to the, in the trash and use their own process, use their own method for collecting data. So you need to take into account, I'm presenting information that is now, new info that we have in a world where things seem to be changing on almost a constant basis. Your lender is the ultimate resource for working with you on determining what exactly is going to be required of you in order to obtain forgiveness. But again, the idea is that any lender out there would be basing what they require on the SBA loan forgiveness application. So I do think that it is safe for us to make some decisions based on some of this information that I'm going to present on now. So the agenda here, again, the HEROES Act is out there. We may see something come out of that, but it sounds like right now possibly a separate bill for the PPP program revisions, and it sounds like they're talking about an infrastructure bill now. So the 2020 CARES Act, again, I'm going to get into the forgiveness application details and a little bit of calculating forgiveness. I'm going to touch on the New Hampshire CARES Act related programs that the governor has been announcing. There's a whole array of different programs that are getting funded with additional money through the state of New Hampshire. And then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A so that we can, give you guys some good answers to specific questions that are related to the context of your situations. So here are our key changes. Okay. So firstly, there's been a change to the FTE calculation for headcount, which I will get into a little further, but basically the gist of it is that we previously were made aware that the FTE calculation that was used to determine headcount in whichever of the reference periods you were using, and then during your 8-week PPP loan period, that the calculation was using the ACA method as its basis, which assumes one FTE equals a 30-hour or more employee, a 30-hour per week or more employee. The new FTE calculation, according to the SBA loan forgiveness application, bases one FTE on a 40-hour work week. So basically what we do is we count all hours worked over the span of time we're measuring, divided by 40, and that is our number of FTEs. Insofar as no individual could represent more than one FTE. So if somebody has, average hours of 44 or 45 hours, they're one FTE. So nobody could be more than one FTE, but it's based on 40 hours a week instead of 30. Now, that shouldn't have a negative impact for most people because the math, you have to change the math on both sides. So you need to use 40 as your basis now for your reference period, which is either 1/1/2020 to 2/29/2020 or 2/15/2019 to 6/30/2019. And you need to use that 40-hour number to determine the FTEs in that span. And then you have to use the same logic to determine your number of FTEs during the covered period. and the covered period is the PPP loan period from the date of the disbursement. 56 days from the 56-day period starting with your date of disbursement. Another change here is that eligible costs may be forgiven provided that they were either paid for or incurred during the covered period. Now, previous to this, we were under the belief that the PPP program really only cared about what you paid for during your 8-week period, your covered period. But now we know that eligible costs, can include costs that were incurred and paid for and during the 8-week loan period or covered period, and also costs that were incurred but were not paid for until the next regular bill date or due date. Both of those now can be considered as forgivable, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on that shortly. Another piece of this that is important to know. In the previous presentations I was giving, I was talking about the rule that they created around spending at least 75% of your PPP loan on payroll costs. That is the verbiage that was previously used. The requirement was to spend 75% or more of your PPP loan on payroll costs, which, from my interpretation, meant the total principal amount. Now, the rule actually is the 75-25 rule actually applies to the money that you spent during the 8-week or 56-day period. So, so you have to have spent at least 25% of the money you spent. Of the money you spent in the 56 days, at least 75% of the spent funds have to have been spent on payroll costs, and no more than 25% of the spent funds could be spent on non-payroll costs, as opposed to the principal amount. So if you have at the end of your loan period, say you had a $200,000 loan, at the end of your loan period you still have $50,000 left. Well, you need to base your 75-25 calculation on the $150,000 you actually spent, not the total principal amount. The next item that is new, in previous guidance that was provided, previous information that we were informed of, it did appear that interest payments on non-mortgage related debt obligations could potentially be included and paid for with PPP money and have that forgiven. By all appearances, because these things are completely omitted from any language in the PPP loan forgiveness application, it does not appear that such things can be paid for with PPP loan money and have that money forgiven. Because there is no language in the application at all that would permit for such things. So, for instance, if you had if your company had gone through an acquisition where you bought out the prior owner and the company was funding the payment on the note, the interest that you pay on that note, we previously thought you could use PPP loan money to pay the interest on that note, but now it appears that you cannot. Everything associated with the payment of interest payments is labeled or is clearly defined within the application as related to mortgage interest and or lease payments, but not interest payments on non-mortgage related debt obligations. So paying off the interest on your credit card, paying off the interest on a note, those things do not appear to be forgivable as far as the spend of your PPP money goes. So now I want to get into a piece of good news, and it's slightly good news. It's not as good news as it might seem on the face of it, but it is somewhat good news. which is that with the publication of the PPP loan forgiveness application, the SBA has created this concept of an alternative covered period. The alternative covered period allows the borrower to choose when the 8-week PPP covered period begins, and the options would be either the date of loan disbursement, as we knew it to be from the beginning, or the first day of the first pay period following loan disbursement. Additionally, because we now know that the eligible costs that may be forgiven are those that were either paid for or incurred during the covered period, it does mean that we don't necessarily have to create a special payroll with a pay date on the last day of your loan period to pay everybody current. We could pay that payroll in the next regularly scheduled payroll and then do a pro rata calculation to determine how much of that payroll cost was related to the PPP loan period or covered period, or rather alternative covered period, rather than having a special pay date that is on the last day of your alternative covered period or covered period. But at the same time, it might still be cleaner from your perspective to do that so that we can know that everybody paid on this pay date. That cleared out as much of our PPP loan money that we had left as possible. But this is something that we will be reaching out to you next week for looking for you to help us understand whether or not you're intending to use the alternative covered period so that we can make sure the reporting that you have access to in our system represents the alternative covered period where applicable, if that is your intention. One of the ways to consider, if you are still considering a special payroll, which I can definitely see the benefit in, then you might make your decision on whether to use the covered period or the alternative covered period on what the last day of the period would be, using one versus the other. Because if we were going to have a pay date on the last day of the period, or perhaps the day before that, then if one of these periods, either the covered period or the alternative covered period, happened to end on a weekend, then you probably would want to use the other period for this purpose, so that you could have that final pay date of the period not on a weekend. But the 8-week or the alternative covered period is allows you to decide to use the first day of the first pay period following loan disbursement for the purposes of all elements of the payroll costs associated with your PPP loan, and for the purposes of your headcount calculation, which is the FTE count, and also the wage reduction calculation. Those three things would become a function of your alternative covered period. Unfortunately, just by choosing the alternative covered period, that does not mean that the concept of the covered period does not apply to you. The concept of the covered period does still apply in all cases where we are talking about non-payroll costs. So for instance, back up to bullet point number 2 here. When we're talking about eligible costs that may be forgiven because they were incurred during the covered period, that is literally the covered period, which starts on the day of disbursement and ends 56 days later or 55 days later. And all of your non-payroll costs have to use the covered period and not the alternative covered period. However, the nice thing here is that any costs that you incur, non-payroll costs that you incur during the covered period, you can still use PPP loan money and have that forgiven, even if you don't pay for that cost until the next regular bill due date. So you do have the opportunity here to include costs that were not paid for during the covered period but were incurred, as long as that cost was paid for by the due date of the next regular bill. So that is both, the concept of the alternative covered period does put us in a position for some people where we'll be able to have a more logical structure of how we're, managing the payment of the payroll wages from our PPP money. But it also is good news on the front of the non-payroll costs, meaning that you can still use your PPP loan money for costs that were incurred but were not paid for during the 56-day covered period. So, one of the thoughts on people's minds now that you're thinking about the alternative covered period might be that, well, oh, that's great because, we had suspended our payroll for 3 pay periods, and we actually picked things up in the second pay period after the disbursement date. We had no pay date in that first pay period, and that would I guess I'll just read this. So in some cases, the borrower may have suspended their payroll entirely during the period when the PPP money was dispersed and may not have started payroll again immediately after receiving the PPP money. The PPP forgiveness application does not address this at all. The application also does not indicate that actual wages must have been paid for the first pay date or first day of the first pay period after disbursement, which means that my guess is that you should use the first day of the first pay period after disbursement, whether or not there was actually a pay date, in order to make sure that you're putting yourself in a position to maximize your forgiveness if the alternative covered period is an attractive option to you. So this is something that we are going to be reaching out to you next week to find out if you're intending to use it. Stay tuned for that. You'll probably be getting an email on Tuesday. So now I just want to add some additional detail on covered period versus alternative. Okay, so the covered period, as I said, is the 56-day span starting on the loan disbursement date. The alternative covered period is the 56-day span starting on the first day of the first pay period following disbursement. So, as I said, it appears the alternative covered period is only applicable to payroll costs associated with the PPP loan money and your possible, forgiveness reductions associated with headcount and the wage reduction, but not non-payroll costs. It appears that the non-payroll costs will always be a function of the 56-day period starting with the loan disbursement date. And then I included this little tidbit from page 2 that says an eligible non-payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. So this means that you can pay for May rent, even if your covered period ends, before you pay the bill for May rent. You can still include that as a forgivable cost, as long as you pay that rent by the next, by the due date, the next billing date. So I do believe that will be beneficial to some folks. So the headcount calculation. So the amount attributable to a workforce reduction basically will be equal to the initial forgiven amount multiplied by the quotient of your average FTEs during the 8-week period, either your covered period or the alternative covered period, divided by the average FTEs for the reference period, which is either 2/15/19 to 6/30/19 or 1/1/20 to 2/29/20. So basically, the big difference here is that the FTE calculation is based on one FTE equals someone who has average hours worked per week of 40 or more, and the FTE calculation for anyone averaging less than 40 hours would be the average hours worked per week divided by 40. However, there's also a safe harbor or a simpler method that they created that you can take advantage of here if it's applicable to you, which is to say that you can call all salaried people 1 FTE, and you can call all non-salaried people 0.5 FTEs. So if that is something that's going to be conducive to your ability to have maximized forgiveness on the headcount front, then you can actually apply the safe harbor and count all of your salaried people as 1, all of your hourly people as 0.5, and calculate your FTEs through that method. But if you're using the hours-based method, it's now 40 hours a week, not 30 hours a week, that makes 1 FTE. So there's now two additional pieces here. The FTE reduction exceptions. You will not sacrifice PPP loan forgiveness due to headcount in relation to any positions for which you made a good faith written offer to rehire an employee, emphasis on written offer to rehire an employee during the covered period or the alternative covered period, and that offer was rejected. And any employees who during the covered period or the alternative covered period were fired for cause or voluntarily resigned or voluntarily requested and received a reduction in their hours, in all of those cases, you will not be penalized if your FTE count at the end of your loan period comes out to be less than the FTE count from the reference period. To the extent that is solely due to these exceptions, you will not sacrifice forgiveness. And then there's also a safe harbor here, which is you're exempt from the reduction in loan forgiveness based on FTE employees if both of these conditions are met. The borrower reduced its FTE employee levels in the period beginning 2/15/2020 and ending 4/26/2020, and the borrower then restored its FTE employee levels by not later than June 30th, 2020 to its FTE level in the borrower's pay period that included 2/15. So what this means is if this condition applies, if you have reduced your FTE count between 2/15 and 4/26, and then you restore that count not later than June 30th back to the 2/15/2020 level, then there's nothing else that you need to even worry about for forgiveness related to the headcount calculation. Now the wage reduction calculation. The wage reduction calculation, and this is more good news. So it took me a while to wrap my head around this, but the Schedule A of the PPP loan forgiveness application has a couple of weird parts to it. One, it has you list out employees in 2 separate tables. In one table, you put everybody that made less than an annualized amount of $100,000 per year in one table. And then in the other table, you put everybody that made $100,000 or more per year once those wages were annualized over the 8-week loan period. The reason behind the 2 tables is because the rule now is that anybody who received annualized wages of $100,000 during the covered period or alternative covered period, which is $15,385 during that whole span of time, basically anybody who earned over $100,000 annualized, they don't care how much you reduced their wages by. So you will not sacrifice any forgiveness by having a wage reduction against somebody who, basically if somebody made $15,385 during your 8-week loan period, but they made $30,000 in Q1, you won't have any penalty associated with your wage reduction for the people that made $100,000 or more annualized. The other thing I want to emphasize here on the wage reduction is the difference between cash compensation and average hourly wage and average hourly or average annual salaries. The PPP loan forgiveness application does have you report the cash compensation that was earned by folks during the 8-week loan period. However, that is not what you are determining your wage reduction on. The wages or the actual earnings received by the staff during your 8-week loan period is not what is going to be used to determine whether or not you're sacrificing any forgiveness on wage reductions. Instead, all wage reduction cares about is what was the average hourly rate of pay for each employee during Q1 versus what was the average hourly rate of pay they earned during the 8 weeks of the PPP covered period. For the salaried folks, all it cares about, it doesn't care about how much they earned. All it cares about is what is the actual annual salary assigned to the person. Compare that to what the actual annual salary assigned to that person was in Q1, and look at what it was in the 8-week PPP loan period. And if you have a difference in the actual scheduled earning or the actual agreed upon salary amount, and that difference is greater than 25%, then you will be sacrificing some forgiveness. But the average annual salary, average hourly wage is not inclusive of everything that goes into cash compensation. And there is no relation between the cash compensation that you're going to be reporting in your forgiveness application and the average annual salary or average hourly wage. So if we think about this in the context of commissioned salespeople, the loan forgiveness application is very, very direct and blatantly calls out in the area where you calculate wage reductions. For salaried people, you use their annual salary for the calculation. For hourly people, you use their hourly rate for the calculation. End of story. So if you have somebody who is a purely, a truly commissioned person, then you're going to have to make a determination of whether or not to call them salary or hourly in the context of your PPP loan forgiveness application. But the nice thing again here is that whether or not, well, I guess the last bullet here, since the wage reduction calculation does not consider the actual compensation earned during the period, but is only concerned with the actual annual salary or regular hourly rate of pay for hourly employees, it appears that forgiveness will not be sacrificed due to fluctuations in commissions earned or overtime hours worked between the covered period or the alternative covered period and the earnings from Q1 2020. Now, unfortunately, for many of our customers, I've already had conversations with folks about this, and prior to the publication of the PPP loan forgiveness application, where we had no guidance on this, we were in a position where we had to make some decisions on how are we going to manage the commissioned salespeople. In some cases, some of you may have already made the decision and executed on it and have been paying commissioned people pay even though they have no sales coming in order to avoid your wage reduction problem. But for those of you that have this concern in your minds, but haven't acted upon it necessarily yet, you can remove that concern from your mind, because again, all that they care about when we talk about wage reduction is what is the standard hourly rate for this person, what was it in Q1 when we average it out across all of the pay periods, assuming that the rate changed from one pay period to another, versus what it was during our 8-week PPP covered period. And if there's a difference of 25% or greater, then you will sacrifice some of your forgiveness. So that is the basic premise of the presentation for today. I know that I've only gone through a half an hour. I want to take as much time as we can to answer some of your questions, because I believe that some of what I just went through might not have been clear as a bell. I also am prepared to take any other questions on anything I have not covered that is related to the PPP loan forgiveness application. But before we get into that, I did want to talk for a minute about the New Hampshire CARES Act related programs. So as you can see, this is a screenshot from the website that the state's put up there for the I don't know why it's called the Gopher. I mean, it's some acronym, of course, but they've created this website, in order to provide all of the information for all of the New Hampshire residents on everything to do with coronavirus, including what the state is doing for state-specific programs, to provide additional funding and resources to organizations that isn't coming to them through the federal level. For anybody who has yet to complete the pre-qualifying application for the Main Street Relief Fund, the Main Street Relief Fund is the program that the state has put in place for small businesses. In order to qualify, you have to have revenues of less than $20 million, and you have to do a pre-application before May 29th to be considered to participate in the program. When you apply for the program, you have to identify what were your last year's revenues, what are your current year projected revenues, how much of a PPP loan you received, any other COVID-related grant money you might have received. And then, as far as I can tell, they're going to be doing some sort of calculation in order to share among all the employers that qualify $400 million of money that the state received from the CARES Act in the form, I believe, of grants. So I highly encourage anybody, even if you don't think that you would necessarily qualify or need to participate. The qualifications literally are you got to have less than $20 million in revenue, and there's like two other things, but there is no qualification here that I recall that actually requires you to have taken a significant loss due to COVID-19. So the other things here that are, I would just encourage you, if you see anything on here that might apply to your organization, I would highly encourage you to come to this website to check it out. Then we have ourselves, as many of you are aware, been creating resources for all of our customers on a regular and ongoing basis, to provide you with as much support on everything you need to know about the CARES Act and COVID-19 generally. And so the web page. There you go. The webpage URL, is here, for the employer general references as an additional resource. Everybody, again, on this webinar will be receiving a copy of the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to click this link to get there. There's a lot of, updates that we're pushing out there. I'm hopeful by Monday I'll be able to have a fair bit of the items that we previously communicated what turns out to now be wrong information on, to have that all cleaned up so that everything here is buttoned down and spot on as far as accuracy goes. I also wanted to mention, for those that aren't aware, we have an OSHA storefront for all of our customers. Everybody who's on this webinar, if you haven't already received it, you will be receiving a set of posters that we're sending you at no cost, which are coronavirus prevention and awareness posters, basically the posters that you see here on the screen. We will be sending you a set of those posters at no cost so that you can start taking action to put them up on your walls, so that you're following best practices for helping your workforce understand how to work together, how to wash their hands, how to disinfect, how to notice whether or not you or employees around you might have symptoms, stuff like that. There's CDC guidelines in a nicely created a document, and also OSHA guidelines as well. Pretty soon we will have what they're calling workforce reopening kits, which will include hand washing signs. It will include surgical masks. I believe it will include nylon gloves. But basically, this is just a resource for folks to put yourself in a position where you have everything that you need to have a safe workforce, have a safe workplace. If you need to buy more of these coronavirus prevention posters, you can go to our website and then go to Checkmate's poster elite, or this is not Checkmate. This is the URL literally for this page up here. So you can go here. You can buy them here. If you use the code 50COV when you make a purchase, you will get 50% off your purchase. So that is the presentation for today. I am now going to go take a look at our question section. If you have questions and you haven't already posted them, please go ahead and start to post them now. Does look like we have a few out here. So, okay. So we've got, employer contribution to 401k. Can this be done as a one-time payment directly to the fund, or does this have to be processed through payroll? I was in another webinar where it stated if profit sharing is done at year end after profit is determined, then it does not seem reasonable to front load a contribution so payment is made during the 8-week period. I thought it was an interesting statement since we have been planning to make a one-time contribution on 2020, but no specific date had been set. Okay, here is my suggestion to you. So yeah, so this question has come up also, and again, if we just think through logistically, my answer to this question is going to be that I would find it almost impossible to believe that it would be legitimate for you to claim to use PPP, forgivable PPP loan money to pay for the employer contribution to the 401k during the 8-week loan period if you don't actually fund that money into the employee's retirement accounts until sometime in Q1 of next year. In fact, right now, you wouldn't even be in a position to say whether or not everybody will qualify to receive the employer contribution in Q1 of next year, because usually that's based on a minimum number of hours worked in the year as well. So what I think you should do is I think you should reach out to your TPA for your 401k and find out from them whether or not your plan allows any changes to the provision of the employer contribution details in the middle of the plan year. Because what I think you should do is consider funding via an employer contribution money into the 401k for your employees, but not in lieu of necessarily. You should consider doing that to before the loan period ends, but not necessarily as a pure and simple replacement for the employer match that you would be making next year. But maybe if you could, again, check with your TPA. If your plan allows you that flexibility, then what you could do is you could say, hey guys, instead of waiting until the first quarter of next year, we're deciding that we're going to fund the employer contribution for your 401k this year. Again, you might have to base that contribution off estimates because your employer contribution is almost always a function of either how much the employee earned or how much the employee themselves contributed to. And now we would be doing this in advance, 7 months prior to when it otherwise, would have been applicable to happen. So with that said, I'm almost. I disagree with what the person said. Though I still think you can front load. You may be giving them even more employer contributions Q1 of next year if your plan disallows the reduction of the scheduled employer contribution just because you front loaded during your PPP loan period. So check with your TPA, see if there's any restrictions against that. As long as there are not, then I'd say go ahead and do it. It's effective. If it's an effective use of your PPP loan money, but you may still be on the hook for the employer match in Q1 of next year, depending on your plan details, which would result in you perhaps providing a little bit more of a generous benefit than you had intended. Question on new wage reduction guidance. I have hourly workers working at 2 different rates of pay, one higher and one lower. I had been sending hours to my employees at the lower pay rate in order to send more money to my employees and lessen the wage reduction. Oops. Hold on, just lost. And lessen the wage reduction. Under this new guidance, will that hurt my average rate of pay and therefore sacrifice forgiveness? Yeah. Yes, it will. Because potentially it could. Because paying the 2 different rates, and if you have been paying disproportionately at the lower rate, then when you do your average rate calculation, the disproportionate payment at the lower rate will, of course, skew your average downwards, which could potentially have an impact on your wage reduction. Hold on one second, though. Because hold on. In essence, what we're talking about here, when we talk about so let me take that back. As I indicated in the presentation, the wage reduction concept does not take into account cash compensation actually paid to the person during the loan period. Therefore, however much you pay the person under one earning versus the other doesn't really matter. They've also provided no details on how to calculate your average wage. So a reasonable way to calculate the average wage when you have 2 different rates of pay is to take 2 different rates of pay, add them together, divide by 2, there's your average. Because the wage reduction calculation does not consider actual cash compensation received, I do not think the multiple rates of pay problem actually is a problem for you. I do believe that you are in a good position there, because again, it could have impact if you didn't have the lower rate in place in Q1. If the lower rate was not in place at all in Q1, therefore your calculation for Q1 would have an average hourly rate that's naturally going to be higher than the average in the loan period. That definitely would hurt you. But if you had the lower rate of pay in place in Q1, you just were paying less money through it, then you should be, in a good position for this to not harm you where forgiveness is concerned. Okay, so I have, okay, perfect. So here we have someone, I have salespeople who are paid hourly plus commission. I have one commission payroll that was $47,000 for just 2 employees. I can't use that whole amount. I can't use that whole amount of that payroll towards my PPP money. I have to, yes. Well, so Lisa, the rule. Okay. The rule you need to worry about. If you had a $47,000 commission payroll that happened during your covered period, and that was 2 people, that basically means you've maxed out loan forgiveness, the possibility of all loan forgiveness on each of those 2 people in a single payroll. The maximum amount that you can have forgiven for any individual, no matter whether they are commissioned, hourly, per diem nurses or whatever. The limitation here is $15,000, $15,385, period. If these 2 individuals earned $15,385 each or more in one payroll, then there won't be a single dollar of additional PPP money that could be used to fund their payroll. And now that I'm thinking about that, yeah, okay, so this is on, so early next week, there's going to be a new report that's available to everybody. I've already created it in one account. I just haven't pushed it out to everybody else yet. And this report is a running totals report, which will run from the beginning of your covered period to the end, or the beginning of your alternative covered period to the end, and it will show you the actual PPP forgivable payroll cost incurred for each person, capping it at $15,385 per person. So that you would be able to use that in conjunction with the already existing PPP forgivable payroll cost report. That's a payroll by payroll cost report. Because right now, in your subsequent payroll to the one with the 47,000, these people would appear to have forgivable PPP money if you just use the report that's already in place. But next week, when you start to use the running totals report as well, you'll know that that there is no forgivable PPP money that you can spend on those people anymore. So again, the rule is $15,385 per person, max, period, end of story. That is the total amount of compensation, cash compensation, that you can pay someone and have it forgiven during your 8-week period. Now, you can still fund their retirement plan. You can still fund an HSA account. You could still fund a medical expense FSA account. You could still provide a form of compensation, but you can't provide cash compensation beyond the $15,385. I also do not understand how to account for my 35-hour per week employees' wages. Okay, so for wage reduction purposes, it doesn't matter. The hours that they work per week does not matter. All that matters is what that hourly rate is, what the average hourly rate is. And in this case, one could make an argument that the proper way to calculate the average hourly rate would be to take all of the wages paid under that average hourly rate during the span of time that we're talking, or during all wages paid under one rate during the span of time, add them all up together. All wages paid under the other rate during that span of time, add those all up together, add both totals together, and then divide by the number of hours worked, and that would potentially give you an average hourly rate that is closer to a function of, proportionally, actually how many hours they worked at each rate. However, this is not called out in the application. The application simply says calculate the average hourly rate. So if I have two numbers in front of me, then I would, one way to do it would be to add them together and divide by 2. But for a 35-hour employee, the hours don't matter. All that matters is what was their average hourly rate during Q1, what was their average hourly rate during the PPP loan period. Is the difference between those two rates more than 25%? And if the answer to the question is yes, then you'll have a forgiveness issue. If not, then on the Schedule A for the PPP loan forgiveness application, all it has you identify is whether or not you had a wage reduction greater than 25%. Yes or no. That's what you're going to complete on the application. And the application does also include some verbiage around the documentation that you need to maintain, not that you need to submit with the application, but that you need to maintain to back up your calculations. And again, I've seen nothing that would indicate to me that this idea of calculating an average rate of pay has to account for the number of hours that they received that rate of pay for ever at all, period. You could do it if you want to. If you want to get a gold star, for probably compliance here, but I don't see any reason why you would have to do that. And if this person that works 35 hours a week earned one rate, only one rate in Q1, and only one rate in your 8-week loan period, you don't even have anything to worry about. You just simply do the calculation. Was this rate lower or higher than the other? And was it higher or lower by 25%? Now, what this means, guys, what this really means is that in order to make up for any wage reduction problem that you have, you do not need to add compensation during the remainder of your covered period. All you need to do is bump that hourly rate back up to what it used to be. You don't even need to process any payrolls with that hourly rate in play. You just need to bump that hourly rate back up to what it used to be, or what the average was from Q1 by 6/30. And as long as you've done that for everyone, you will sacrifice no forgiveness due to wage reductions. Again, emphasis, guys. Wage reduction. It sounds counterintuitive, I understand, but the wage reduction calculation does not take into account anything to do with how much they actually earned in the 8-week loan period or the Q1 span of time. Apparently, we previously were under the impression that we had to take annualized wages earned in Q1 and compare that against annualized wages earned and received during the covered period. But no, we have to compare the annualized hourly rate of pay or the annualized salary that was assigned to the person in Q1 versus the annualized hourly rate of pay or the annualized salary that they had assigned to them during our covered period. Our fees associated with the healthcare reimbursements, mass health safety net surcharge, pediatric immunization program assessment, can we use the funds to pay for these? That is a good question. And my answer to that question is yes. The reason why I say that is twofold. On the one hand, there is direct language that does speak to the fact that you can use PPP loan money and have it forgiven for the payment of employer-incurred state taxes. So SUTA, being one of those, but these also would be, I do believe that would apply as well to these particular items that you're discussing, but also, yes, a healthcare reimbursement. Associated with health. Oh, hold on, sorry, I misread your question. Okay, our fees associated with healthcare reimbursements. Can we use? Okay, so let me think that through. Healthcare reimbursement. So, yes, I believe you can, because it turns out, and I actually meant to include an item on this in the presentation. I forgot. Utilities. So one of the questions that I had for a long time was they called out one of the things that you could use under the label of utilities that you could pay for was transportation, and upon digging further and upon some further guidance from the SBA, it turns out that the transportation they're talking about is mileage reimbursement. So if you can use PPP loan money to cover mileage reimbursement, then I suppose it would make sense that you could use it to cover reimbursements for the health safety net surcharge and pediatric immunization program assessments. I don't see any reason why you couldn't do one but not the other. That said, again, I will answer that. I will tell you that I have probably a 60% certainty on the answer to that question. It is one that would possibly be worthwhile. Would definitely be worthwhile for me to look into. So Valerie, I'll look into that a little deeper and get back to you early next week sometime. Okay. So I think I just answered this question. But under utilities, it indicates transportation costs. What do they mean by this? Also, are vehicle lease and loan payments eligible? Okay. So yes, and possibly yes. Possibly yes to the second question, and to the answer to the first question is for my understanding, mileage reimbursement for vehicle expenses. So if your employee drives a company vehicle and had to get the oil changed, and you then reimburse the employee for the oil change, that would be a transportation utility cost. So mileage reimbursements, repairs, maintenance on vehicles are primarily what is meant by transportation as a utility. And yes, vehicle lease payments. It is very clear in the language of the forgiveness application that I'm actually going to read the language because I think it's important. So hold on one second. Okay, so eligible non-payroll costs include covered mortgage obligations, payment of interest, not including any prepayment or payment of principal on any business mortgage obligation on real or personal property incurred before 2/15/2020. This I do believe would include if the company, if there's a company vehicle that the company is paying, paying a loan on. This would include the interest on that auto loan. Under covered rent obligations, it says covered rent obligations, business rent or lease payments pursuant to lease agreements for real or personal property in force before 2/15/2020. This, based on that language, for business rent or lease payments pursuant to lease agreements for real or personal property, meaning something tangible, as in a car that you are leasing. Yes, you can use non-payroll PPP money to pay the lease payment on a company vehicle, to pay the interest on the auto loan for a company vehicle. I do believe those are both valid and legitimate forgivable costs that you can spend no more than 25% of your total principal from your PPP loan on and have it all forgiven. So the last question that we have right now is, does propane costs qualify as a utility? Yes, definitely. Propane, gas, steam, if you had steam power, the electricity, phone, cell phones. I consider cell phones to be in that group. Yes, that is definitely a utility. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the context in which propane might not be a utility. I suppose perhaps if you're a propane company, buying propane to grill food, maybe. But if you're using propane to heat the building, or run your hot water heater or any of that, then yes. Now, keep in mind, you will need to, the application does specify in great detail all of the documentation you're going to need to provide to the bank. And you will be needing to provide to the bank documentation that proves that those things that you are calling utilities, are actual utility bills that you had to pay, or incurred during the covered period. So you will be on the hook for providing detail behind this, but as long as it's a standard use of propane, like heat, hot water, etc., then yes, that would be a forgivable cost that you can include, or spend your PPP loan money on. So with all that said, okay, here we go. Propane to run forklift and warehouse equipment. Perfect. Yep, absolutely. Yes, propane to operate your business, which would include heating your facility, running your machines, yes, absolutely, that is a utility. All right, so I'm going to hang out for a number of minutes here in case anyone else has more questions that you would like to ask. But that kind of wraps up my presentation for today. Again, I'll stick around for a few minutes to see if any more questions come through. Again, everybody will receive a copy of this webinar. The recording of the presentation will be up on our website on our COVID-19 resource page. Should be by Monday. In the meantime, if you have any additional questions, if you need support, I'm more than happy. Oh, and also everybody will have the loan forgiveness spreadsheet in the email that we send by Monday. If anybody has questions or absolutely needs some of my time to help you, parse through the details here to help you with your unique specific circumstance, I am happy to do that. Send an email to your client account manager and COVID-19@checkmatepayroll.com. And I will make sure that you get on my calendar so that I can give you some attention directly, helping you to put all of this into the context of your unique circumstance. And initially, the idea here is I want to put it out there to get online to help you guys out. I have no intention of charging a fee for it. If during our conversation, you end up asking for stuff that would, require a fee, then I'll let you know, before we do any work. But the idea here would be if you need some of my time, I'm going to try to do what I can to make myself available so that you can proceed through the rest of your loan period and maintain a sense of sanity. Okay, so if I work up a spreadsheet to confirm my PPP is forgivable, so yes, absolutely. Just like, I just said, I'd be happy to, have a conversation with you around it. I'm absolutely, anybody who wants to, work up your own spreadsheet and show it to us, show it to me. I will take a look at that. I will see if I can see any glaring errors in your analysis. I will be more than happy to do that. Just to make sure, we have a healthcare reimbursement invoice paid on 4/17, which is after our loan was received. But the invoice date from the vendor is 4/3. And the period covering the invoice is March 2020. How do I, good question. So the language says pretty clearly that, and I'll just read it one more time. The language on forgivable non-payroll costs, forgivable non-payroll costs. Ineligible non-payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date. So basically, because of the fact that they forgot to include language here, assuming that they would have wanted it there, that says, those things paid during the covered period must have been incurred during the covered period, but you can also use, the money to pay for bills that were incurred during the covered period but paid subsequent. It doesn't say anything about bills that were paid during the covered period but incurred prior to the covered period. Therefore, you can use PPP money to pay for this because you paid the bill during the covered period. Apparently, all bills you pay during the covered period, no one cares when the cost was incurred. The only time we care when the cost was incurred is for those bills that were paid after the end of the covered period, because the cost had to have been incurred during the covered period for those to be forgivable. When did that happen? Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? No? Yeah, okay. Good. All right, thank you. Okay, so I think that answers that last question, yes. Basically, there's no language that prevents you from using PPP money to pay for a bill that you paid during your covered period, even if that bill was incurred some other time in the past. But based on all of the language, I think it's very clear that it is not appropriate to use PPP loan money to pay for future bills that you have not received any invoice for yet. I do believe that is a fair judgment call. Is the loan application due a specific date or based on your disbursement date? So the loan application, basically, there is no, to my knowledge, specific due date on the loan forgiveness application itself. Hold on one second. However, the application form expires on 10/31, and the bank the only date range that I can recall in regard to forgiveness in the application is that the bank has 60 days to review your application and make a determination. I believe that the banks are probably going to be providing us with some guidance on, when they need you to submit the application. So I would lean on them, I would lean on your lender for helping you understand when the due date of that forgiveness application will be. So kind of on a final note, guys, there's a whole bunch of reports out there that most of you have in your accounts right now. The FTE count reports, of course, were originally based on 30 hours a week. We are making updates to those reports so that they're based on 40 hours a week. We are also putting in place the running totals PPP forgivable payroll cost report so that you can see for any instances where at some point during the 8 weeks somebody hits the 15,385 level, you'll be able to see that they've maxed out and there is no forgivable money for them. I'm also going to update the logic on the forgivable payroll cost report that people are already using to move money into your payroll account from your PPP account in order to make it so that it will not show any wages as forgivable that were earned by any staff above and beyond the 15,385 once that threshold is hit. You guys will be getting an email from us next week that summarizes all of the reports that you now have in your account and the purpose that those reports serve for each piece of the PPP forgivable forgiveness application, so that everybody understands why those reports are out there, what we're doing, or what you're doing with them, and what fixes we made to them in order to help you prepare to complete your PPP loan forgiveness application. All of these reports are intended, each of these reports perform a very specific function to inform what you are ultimately going to need to use to populate your loan forgiveness application when that time comes. So we are going to make those modifications and introduce at least one, if not two more new reports for you guys. Push them out into your accounts. You'll get an email from us on this probably Tuesday, but maybe Wednesday, that it's all ready for you to start using. And these are going to be, to the extent that we're making fixes to the existing reports, they will have you will be using the same report that you've been using. It just will have right information now, where it previously had information that was right according to what we previously understood. So with all that said, let's see, we've got a couple more here. So vehicle loan or lease, we can use funds for interest only for auto loan and full amount for lease, correct? As far as I know, that is correct. There is no language here that prohibits the use of the use of the money for a portion of a lease versus the full amount. So and it's very clear that it is for rented or leased property, physical equipment, physical property. Now, the thing that is pretty clear here is that it must be tangible. So we can't be talking about anything that you might have a lease arrangement around or a rental arrangement around that is not actually a physical, tangible, thing. So did you say state tax could be paid with loan money or a prorated part of it? So the your SUTA tax can be paid for with PPP loan money. So payroll-related employer taxes, payroll-related state taxes that are paid for by the employer can be paid for with PPP loan money. The loan analysis report includes personal use of company auto money. Should that have been excluded? So so on that, so I'll answer this question from like two angles. One is that the loan analysis report that we created was intended to be used for you when you applied for your PPP loan. And perhaps if we did include the custom taxable fringe earning in that analysis, in retrospect, we should not have. However, the decision has already been made for the provision of your PPP loan money, and now that loan money has been dispersed, your job is to make sure that it is spent only on forgivable costs. The personal use of a company vehicle. Most of our customers do not provide payment or do not account for the personal use of a company vehicle on a payroll by payroll basis, but it's done usually once a year or so. The cost that's incurred for the personal use of a company vehicle by the employee, though, if it is a custom taxable fringe earning, isn't actually a payment to the employee. Therefore, it wouldn't be part of your forgiveness, the PPP loan money that you would be needing to have forgiven, because you wouldn't actually have paid anything. It's just, a personal use of a company vehicle, custom taxable fringe just increases their federal income taxable wage. So yes, to the extent that we included that in the loan analysis report, and then you use that to obtain your loan amount, it should have been excluded, and that was an oversight on our part. I would reach out to your bank, to your lender, and just ask them the question that now that you've realized that there was, a small piece of the compensation or a small piece of your calculation from the loan or from the loan application or applying for the loan initially, that turns out in retrospect to have been done wrong. You can ask the bank if they believe that you should consider your principal loan amount to actually be reduced by that amount, and therefore be an amount that you would pay back, or incur interest on. Or if they would say, at this point, don't worry about it. You got your loan money. Now it's just a matter of making sure that everything is forgivable. I would reach out to your lender and ask that question. They will be able to give you the best guidance. I don't want to tell you something that's going to have you now, turn around and have that money not be forgiven. So I excluded it when I applied. Okay, good for you. Yes, so that was smart. So now you don't even need to ask them. Yes, because that was definitely something that we should have considered before. It should not be part of this analysis or equation at all. Okay, so let's see. There's one question here I answered partly, but I didn't answer fully, which was the state tax piece. The prorated part I didn't answer, which is so the payroll-related state taxes can be paid for with PPP loan money, and yeah, if you ended up having us process your final payroll that includes PPP loan money in it on the next scheduled pay date after the end of the loan period, then we'll need to do a prorated calculation to determine how much of that money represents wages earned through the end of the PPP loan period versus how much represents wages earned after, and through that mechanism, the state tax that you would be able to use to pay or be able to use PPP money for would also need to be prorated, so that you only paid that state tax on the wages that were paid during or the wages, the liability for which was incurred during the 8-week loan period. You would only be able to use that portion of the state tax liability from that payroll. You'd only be able to use the PPP loan money for that portion, and then the funding for the additional state tax that represents the earnings earned after the end of the loan period would have to come from another source. So, with all that said, everybody will be getting a copy of the webinar. Everybody will be getting a copy of this presentation. Everybody will be getting a copy of the PPP forgivable payroll cost spreadsheet or calculator. Everybody will be getting updated versions of the reports that we've already put in your accounts. so that we bring them in line with the new rules here. Um, and and again, just put it out there if you do need or want some direct attention from me on your specific scenario. Email your CAM, copy COVID-19 at checkmatepayroll.com in order to let us know. And I will be providing another webinar next Friday or possibly Monday, which is going to go into how we now take that original loan, the loan forgiveness calculator that I provided everyone, and apply all of these new rules, basically just walking through that, and then how to take the reports out of Checkmate and use those to complete your forgiveness application. We're going to walk through both of those two things in that next webinar, which is going to be next Friday or Monday, depending on which I figure out. But stay tuned for that, and we will record that one as well. So if you're not able to attend, then it is not the end of the world. Everybody, I am happy to help, happy to provide us as a resource for this. So, it's the least that we can do to help you guys along. This is a, it's kind of a disaster within a disaster. So again, it's the least that we can do. What we need everybody else, all of you guys to do, who've joined us for this webinar, is focus on bringing your business back to where it needs to be. Focus on, taking care of your staff, and everything else that you need to have your attention on. That's why we're doing this, I'm happy that we're getting a very good response from all of our customers on it. So I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday weekend, and we'll be in touch with you next week with all of the resources that I just laid out. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Happy holiday weekend, and we'll talk sometime in the near future. Take care.